Hello friends, this is the lesson number 26 in the series of criticism in English literature. In the previous lessons we discussed Henry James, George Eliot, S.T. Coleridge or so, and now in this lesson we shall consider Mathew Arnold as a critic. Guys, he was considered as the first modern critic. He was not thinking like the other traditional critics, rather he was thinking like the critiques that we find in the practical criticism or new criticism. You will get to know pretty soon about his criticism. But remember, he is considered as the first modern critique. He is also called as the critique's critique, means he was the critique of the other critiques. He was telling the other critics how to criticize. And his important works we consider, though he was writing prominently in the Victorian age, and about his prominent work apart from the criticism we shall consider in the British literature segment. And here I am just mentioning a few titles. So these are the titles of his works of criticism. Preface to his poems, this is the first title. Preface to his poems in the year 1853. So he had written a collection of poems, and to those collection he wrote a preface. And there is another work, Culture and Anarchy, published in the year 1869, and then Study of Poetry 1888. Most of the times, even when I went through several past year question papers, these titles were asked to match with their authors. Like even other writers of the criticism, they had their work from the T.S. Eliot, from Mathew Arnold, and from even from the new criticism critics like Noam Chomsky or I.A. Richards. So these titles, their names we have to just cram. And the one more important work, that is Function of Criticism at Present Time, published in the year 1864. So just try to remember these titles if you could, because there are questions in the past year question papers. Anyway, we'll consider some of his key concepts. The first, architectonics. Architectonics, from architect this word is coming, and it is given in the title which I mentioned, that preface to his poems. So in that work, in the preface, this concept is given. Here he talks about the unity of the parts of any work. So there has to be a unity, and secondly, these parts should subordinate each other to make a whole. So in any work there can be several parts, but he is saying that these parts should be in subordination to each other to make a whole. So collectively there shouldn't be any individuality between these parts or among these parts. And he also says that the expression of idea more important than the depiction of human action. Like in poetry or in prose, when you are expressing your ideas, that is one thing, and when you are expressing any action, you are writing about someone's action and you are writing about someone's ideas, which thing is more important? According to T.S. Eliot, idea is more important than the action, because describing any action is pretty simple, but it is very difficult. Even if you have to describe your own ideas, it will be difficult. So expressing someone's ideas is quite difficult, and that is more important than expressing action or describing actions. So I repeat, in this architectonic concept he is simply saying First, the parts in any work. There can be one part can be good, can be bad, and we have to collectively see those parts, and these parts should subordinate each other, should be attached to each other in such a way that should produce a larger picture to make a big whole. A great picture should it create, not individuality has to be there in the parts. And the same thing as earlier critics said, that even if a part is bad or not up to the quality, we should not criticize the whole work. We should see the whole work as a single unit. Only then we should you can say describe, or we should consider the work whether it is good or bad, considering every aspect and taking all the parts as a whole. And second, he also says about the scatter images can't produce the whole picture. So the unity of the separate parts has to be there. Only then the bigger whole can be produced. And the second idea is about that expression of idea is more important than the depiction of action. And now about his views on poetry. As I mentioned earlier, there is a work called Study of Poetry. In that work, he has talked about his ideas of poetry. So first he says that it is the criticism of life. Poetry is the criticism of life, our life, and it is to be governed by the poetic truth and poetic beauty. The poetic truth and poetic beauty we have already discussed. We can somewhere relate poetic truth to the truthful reality of our life. That is the poetic truth. So whatever is reality, whatever is we see in the life, that should reflect in the poetry. This is poetic truth. And poetic beauty is something related to the beauty of the poetry, means how rhythmic, how means emotional and pleasing the poetry is. That is poetic beauty. So the criticism of life has to be governed, means under the impact of these two concepts, poetic truth and poetic beauty. Adding to it, he says that still poetry can sustain alone, even without poetic truth and beauty. But he still said that okay, if there is possibility, there should be poetic truth and beauty. Then he talks about some general things like the belief of the people in religion are shaking. So people are losing their faith, and in that sort of situation, there is no, you can say, the truthfulness in the lives of the people. There is a chaos in the society, and people are just living for only themselves. They are not living for the society, or there is no harmony in the life. He takes one example from the poem, that is Dover Beach. He has written a poem, Dover Beach, and in that poem he says that let us be true to one another. Let us be true to one another. The world is crumbling down. So the world is just crumbling down. So there is no hope. Only one hope is there, that we should be truthful to one another. Only that way we can survive. Then he considered that the poetry is superior to science and philosophy and religion. So three fields, religion, science and philosophy, and by comparing to these three, he says poetry is far superior than this. And even he adds that science is not complete. Science is incomplete without poetry. So poetry should be there. Even for the scientific views, the poetry should add meaning to the science. Like I have already told you that what is poetry? Poetry is about the truthfulness. Poetic truth and poetic beauty has to be there. So whatever the science do, in science or you can say the scientists do, they should consider, they should be under the influence of the poetic truths. The things they do, it shouldn't be, you can say, harmful for the humanity. Then he also considered that religion and philosophy also gives way to the poetry. So as a whole, we can produce that poetry is larger, or you can say is more important than other three things. And then there comes a quote by him, that is, poetry as a breadth and finer spirit of knowledge. Poetry as a breadth and finer spirit of knowledge. It is said by Mathew Arnold. Moving on. Then he talks about the qualities of a good poem. What are the basic principles to form a good poem, and what should be the content? So first simple thing, he says that the poetry should stick to the moral values. So there has to be moral values in the poem. Otherwise there cannot be any good poetry. Second, high truth and seriousness. And the third is classical values. We shall try to just analyze these 3 points. About the moral values, what he says, if a poetry revolts against the moral values or morals, it is similar to the revolt or revolting against the life. So poetry shouldn't revolt against the life, as the poetry shouldn't revolt against the morals. So morals or the moral values has to be there in the poetry. Then he gives one example, that he himself wrote a poem, Empedocles on Etna. Empedocles on Etna, it was a poem written by him, and he himself removed this poem from his collection because the subject matter of this poem was not good, or was not sticking to the morals. So that is why he himself removed this poem. And he himself received some criticism, maybe from his friends or the readers, that this poem, it does not really give the hope to the people, or it is rather leaving the readers as hopeless and crushed. It is not producing delight in their mind or not giving them the moral instructions. So that is why he himself criticized his own poem and removed it from the collection. Then we discussed, or we talked about high truth and seriousness. So high in matter and manner, like Aristotle used to write, or used to say rather. So the content matter has to be of a grand style or of a higher style. So superior in diction, so the writing style has to be quite superior, not ordinary language that Wordsworth used to say. Then he takes 3 big names from the ancient literature. He says that Homer is best suited for grand style. If someone is to write a poetry in grand style, then Homer is the best, you can say, man to copy or to follow. Then Milton, John Milton, he is talking about for severe grand style, because on the basis of Paradise Lost, he is saying that John Milton is best for severe, of a higher grand style, even one level up, you can say. Then he talks about Dante Alighieri, an Italian poet of Middle Ages of 12th or 13th century. So Dante, you might have heard his name. So his Divine Comedy. So he's talking about Dante, that Dante fits for both, for grand style and severe grand style. So remember these 3 names he discussed as a, you can say, good example to be followed: Homer, Milton and Dante. Then the third one is classical values. So whenever the word comes classical, classic means old, but old means way back, means of the ancient writers and the poets, that is classical. So he's saying that the Victorian age, as I earlier mentioned, that the Victorian age he was writing in, and in that period there was the industrialization. So the people were suffering, and even in the works of Wordsworth we find that the people were just leading a boredom of the city life. So there was no spirituality. The people were spiritually weaker, and to remove or to get away from this weakness, he was saying that one should move towards the classical works and classical writers. So for all those things like spiritual weakness, for too much scientific you can say things, and the materialism with the industrialization, he was favoring or he was recommending the authors or the poets or the critics to go for the classical ones. He says that if you are supposed to write something new in this age, there are not good characters available, and if you want such good characters, then go for the ancient ones, and such good characters you can easily find in the classical literature. And he also says that the moderns may look towards the ancient ones for their hopes. Means here moderns means the his contemporaries. He's not talking about, in fact, how can he talk about the 20th century writers, because he was living in 19th. So here moderns means his contemporary ones. These people, they can look towards the ancient ones and get inspired from them. Only then they can write. He says that classicals, they have pathos, simplicity and morality in their works, and the moderns are not suited for grand style of poetry, as they have moral weakness. Grand style of poetry means the poetry with, you can say, with larger theme and structure, like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey is there, or Virgil's Aeneid. You just you can say search on the Google, may not go through these titles, but at least even in the European literature segment you can find a bit of discussion in this channel about Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, how large is their structure. Like even in epic Mahabharata, you are familiar to it, so they are larger in structures and theme as well. So these sort of things, even John Milton's Paradise Lost is also of a grand style. So then he says that if moderns, they do not imitate the classical ones, then their poetry would be like a comic or comedy or light comedy. It won't be that serious. So that is why he says that one should get inspirations from the classical ones, from the ancient ones. So simple result, that he is considering the ancient ones as great ones, and one should get inspiration from these writers. And then he adds that the ancient culture may not suit to the moderns, to his contemporaries, but at least these writers should look for their inward qualities. So the culture that is different in the ancient ones and in the modern ones in the 19th century. So he's saying just go for the inward qualities of the ancient characters and their or even in the works of their ancient writers. He takes one example from Hamlet. Okay, it is not an ancient work or not a classic work, but still he takes this sort of example from William Shakespeare's Hamlet, and he says that Hamlet, the inward man, is always there and everywhere. Means the character of Hamlet, and if you have gone through a bit of summary of this play, Hamlet is a confused man in dilemma always, whether to do or not, whether to commit something or not. And that sort of a man can be found everywhere. So he is saying that that sort of you can say the characters, or that sort of you can say the mindset can be produced. It is not that the Hamlet story can be only in the 16th century or 15th, sorry, yes, that's the 16th century when Shakespeare was writing in the last half. So it is not that the Hamlet was only that time. Even these sort of Hamlets can be found everywhere. Even we can find in our society. So that sort of confused man. So that he's saying that go for the inward quality of those characters which are found in the ancient literature. So the writer should imitate the classical to reach high standards. So imitation of the classical ones he is recommending. and it's already now close to 20 minutes, and I think that I should wind up this lesson here, and we shall continue because about Matthew Arnold's criticism, it's a long journey. We may take 2 or 3 lessons, even 4. So let's see how many it does take. So for the moment, I think it's enough for this lesson. In the next lesson, we shall discuss the highly important topic of his criticism, that is touchstone method and practical criticism, what he says about these things. So thanks a lot for watching this lesson, and have a great day.